Perhaps one of the most difficult and controversial discussions about the Civil War is, of course, a discussion of what caused it, its origins, its causes. Of course, if I asked you a simple question, what caused the Civil War, you could provide probably a host of answers, starting with proximate examples or proximate causes of the Civil War, meaning the most immediate causes. You might point to, of course, the matter of secession and Lincoln's desire to preserve the Union, what he saw as his constitutional duty to uphold the Union, the election of Lincoln triggering secession. All of these are causes. However, what I'm asking about, and obviously what you are looking for, is what is the root cause of this business? I cannot say I can provide you with a definite answer to this question, simply because there is some deal of disagreement over this. I have my interpretation, which I believe is the right view, or perhaps a more correct view than others based on evidence. But other people have marshaled evidence to support other credible arguments as well. Briefly, we'll take a look at some of these different views and address them through time, and then we'll get to our interpretation. After discussing that, we'll talk more about the reasons why people fought and the early war. First, we have the Southern interpretation, and this is pretty much the same kind of interpretation that Southerners applied during the Civil War itself as to explain why the war started. In their view, states had precious rights. Among those rights was, for example, the right to decide matters of slavery, and that any federal attempt to limit that decision, whether it be in states where slavery already existed or in new states, say by banning the expansion of slavery, threatened those rights. And it also threatened Southern interests. The states' rights people would say what really caused the Civil War was the fact that Southern states did not like the overbearing nature of the federal government. Slavery was not the central issue. They fought over states' rights, and that's why they seceded from the Union. I have some problems with this interpretation. Namely, one must wonder which state's right South Carolina or Georgia seceded to protect. Then again, they might retort, and rightfully so. As we've seen in our past, many Southern interpreters or Southern interpretations of the states' rights argument people will rightfully point out, look, this is a South that had a tradition of defiance against federal authority, or what they saw as overbearing federal authority. For example, the Virginia and Kentucky resolves written by Jefferson and Madison early on. And of course, the nullification crisis during the Jackson administration certainly point to a Southern defiance. Next, you have a more Northern interpretation, meaning that the causes of the war were slavery and Southern treason. In other words, many Northerners will simply tell you that the Civil War was fought to end slavery, and that the Southerners' secession was treason. And those are the two causes of the war. Basically, that slavery caused the war. It was the sole problem. I don't disagree with them. However, that is a Northern interpretation. And we will have to address these more as we go through this unit and as you read Confederates in the Attic. There are economic interpretations. There's a Northern economic interpretation of the cause of the war, meaning that the Southern slave system essentially caused the war, which is basically the slavery argument. And the Southern one, which argues that Northern industrialists were taking over the financial center of the country, or trying to, and they were trying to subjugate an agrarian South. Certainly one can marshal evidence to support this. At the time of the Civil War, the United States was starting to undergo a serious change. There was greater buildup of manufacturing and industrialization, especially in the North, where there was no plantation system. In the South, there was indeed a plantation system and little industry. Southerners view themselves as people preyed upon because As the northern manufacturing and industrial model began to expand and move west, it basically threatened the livelihood and way of life of the southern plantation system. So some southern scholars have often viewed the cause of the war as one of economics. There is a constitutional interpretation to this, which simply looked at matters of slavery as well as the nature of the Constitution as ill-defined, basically arguing that slavery had been accepted by the original Constitution. It hadn't really been dealt with seriously, as we've discussed, and therefore it was an incomplete and imperfect Constitution that was signed with a serious flaw, which it really left little mechanism to address. There's also a class-based argument, which was that Southern planters controlled the Southern political and economic system and caused the war to protect their own financial interests. In other words, the South fought the war to protect the slave system and the richest 1 to 2% of Southern white society. This argument was often forwarded by many poorer whites and veterans in the South, and even President Andrew Johnson would agree with this basic interpretation. Well, all of these aren't all of the interpretations of the cause of the war, but all of these have some merit. I find them all problematic at some level. Even the northern one totally, because some of the northern interpretations you have to understand, are ones influenced by veterans groups in the Grand Army of the Republic after the war, and the legacy of the way that Northerners approached the topic of the war, the subject of the war afterwards, and they remember themselves as the liberators of slaves and trying to redefine their experience in the war. I believe that whether one examines the causes of the Civil War economically, politically, or socially, one finds that all roads lead to one starting point, and that is slavery itself. The states' rights argument I find problematic simply because the states' right that South Carolina and Georgia seceded to protect was their right to keep slaves. Even in the nullification crisis, when they threatened over the tariff, part of the reason the tariff was predatory in their eyes was because they were in an economy that had a plantation system. I find that economics is also not totally to blame. Because economically, while indeed, I agree, the slave system and plantation system in the South certainly hemmed the South in and caused the war, there were other more basic social factors as well, including the Southern unwillingness to free blacks and have them in American society after all these years of slavery. There was the question of what they would do. Also, economically, the problem is that many slave owners would feel that they would need to be compensated for this. Then there's the question of expansion, and I think expansion really, and politics really demonstrate one of the key problems of the South, that is a result of the slave system, is that because the slave system only worked in certain areas, you had to have a certain kind of climate and geography for the plantation system to work, and therefore the main slave system, the expansion of America became a problem. The South had always been worried about its number of representatives and its representation in Congress. Very quickly, as the North began to industrialize and experience a population growth due to immigration, the South started to lose out and be dwarfed in the House of Representatives. But at least the Senate, they hoped, if the number of slave states and free states could be balanced, would be preserved equally. It became a problem for them, as I think one clearly sees demonstrated in the election of 1860. After all, in the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected without a single Southern vote. What did American expansion do for the South? Many promoted it, hoping that they could expand and have the institution of slavery expand out to the Southwest. And many even dreamed of a large southern empire expanding into Mexico, in South America, and the Caribbean that would all have plantations and slaves. But this didn't happen. And the open talk of abolition of slavery, many Southerners felt as a political a political affront to them. So any possible attack on the South they viewed that way, and the South needed to expand, quite frankly, in order to remain a politically viable section of the country. The South had been a viable interest group section of the country since the foundation of the United States. Very quickly, with the advance of industrialization and immigration in the North and the population expansion in the industrial economy in the North, very quickly the South started to be dwarfed in terms of population and in terms of political representation. And as industry took hold in places west and slavery did not expand, any threat to the expansion of slavery further threatened the future of the South as a viable interest location in the country. Once again, I believe the election of 1860 is a perfect example of this. Southerners, Abraham Lincoln did not even have enough signatures on the petition. He could not be put on a single Southern ballot. Yet, he was still able to win the presidency. He was able to win enough electoral votes and enough popular votes to be president of the United States, which meant that, in essence, politically, the South could be solid and strong as a region, vote solidly in favor of one particular candidate, and still not be able to not be able to really make a dent. Socially, Southerners and Northerners were equally racist, but socially, the South had no plan of or way of integrating African Americans into society as participating citizens on somewhat equal footing. So in the end, in the final analysis, when one looks at it, I believe that all roads lead to slavery. When one asks what caused the Civil War, quite simply, it was the institution of slavery as an unresolved problem that was allowed to continue at the signing of the Constitution and during the Revolution, and that this is an inherent problem for the South. It was a moral burden, which many people saw as a moral wrong. It was an economic problem that affected the Southern economy, and as the Northern industrial economy was changing, affected the South. It also affected, if one looks at the states' rights examples or reasons for the cause of the Civil War, beneath that has to be a serious discussion of slavery and its role and importance in Southern society. In the end, what caused the Civil War was the institution of slavery.